Hello, my name is Alan Zundell, and I will be posting this to both of my channels, Political Dharma and Buddha Meets Jesus, because it covers topics of both politics and religion. In this episode, I want to talk about the views associated with those of Vice President J.D. Vance. Now, I've been looking at Christian nationalism in one of my earlier videos and saying how I want to talk about it more. So I thought I'd look into Vance's views, but he does not call himself a Christian nationalist. What he actually uses is the term post-liberal Catholic. Of course, Vance is a convert to Catholicism, and he has a Harvard education, so he's become very well read in this particular field of Catholic social thought. Now, what is a post-liberal Catholic? He appeared 2 years ago on a panel on the future of liberalism and gave a commentary after the presentation of the main speaker, one Patrick Deneen, and indicated that he has a lot of affiliation with Deneen in the remarks that Vance gave, although he didn't have a lot to say about the specifics of it. Deneen is an author of several books. The one they're discussing here was his, at the time, recently released book from 2023, June of 2023, actually, I think, is when it came out, called Regime Change Toward a Post-Liberal Future. So post-liberal, that's the term that Vance is using. So you would think that Deneen has a lot to say on the thoughts of J.D. Vance. Here is a passage from the publisher's description of the book, and he says that Deneen says, what is needed is the strategic formation of a new elite aligned with the interest of the, quote, many, unquote. Their top-down efforts to form a new governing philosophy, ethos, and class could transform our broken regime from one that serves only the so-called meritocrats. So he is proposing a new elite to replace an old elite, and presumably that's what post-liberalism is about. The old elite would be the liberals. The new elite would be this post-liberal type of elite with this philosophy, and J.D. Vance being one of them, presumably is at the forefront of this movement and will likely be a presidential contender in 2028 because Trump has pretty much designated him as the heir to the MAGA movement, but that's a ways off, so we'll see what results of it. So who is this Deneen and what does he have to say? Now I'm going to go to some clips from that panel discussion on the future of liberalism, particularly from the speaker, in fact, exclusively from the speaker and not in Vance's remarks, which I didn't find added a lot to Deneen's thought here, and critique it because he talks about things that I'm pretty darn well familiar with, and I found his analysis not very spot on, to say the least. I think he really misconstrues what's been going on in modern history, although he has an interesting take on Aristotle and leaves out a significant part of Aristotelian thought about a good regime. So let's start off, first of all, with what does Aristotle have to say and what is Deneen's take on this. This comes, again, from a panel on the future of liberalism, and you can find it on the YouTube channel Intercollegiate Studies Institute from about 2 years ago. All right.
Going all the way back to antiquity, if we read the works of Plato and Aristotle's name I'll probably mention a few times here tonight, Aristotle in particular states outright that all political regimes, and I use this word advisedly, all political orders are divided in one fundamental way, between the few and the many. All political regimes have a kind of tension built into them. And that everywhere this seems to be a truth that Aristotle with his empirical political science hat on, says that one sees this in the fact that when he looks around contemporary Greece of his day, there seem to be two predominant regime types. democracy, which was true of his Athens where he was living and writing, and oligarchy, the regime of the many and the regime of the few. And Aristotle, if you've studied some Aristotle, you can remember back to your days in Introduction to Political Theory. Aristotle regarded both of these regimes as vicious, as reflecting a kind of vice. They weren't one of the regimes he regarded as good, as the sort of exemplary forms of a good regime. In other words, they were not regimes, democracy, the regime of the many, and oligarchy, the regime that favors the few. They were not regimes that were constituted in order to realize the common good, the good of everyone in the society. They were regimes of a certain kind of party, the party of the many or the party of the few. And because of this fact, Aristotle said, because these regimes, oligarchy or democracy, were always constituted to favor some number and some limited number of people within the regime, based upon typically class, it meant that these regimes were prone to two likely trajectories. And in fact, these two likely trajectories were likely to follow one upon the other. The first was civil war, that in the pursuit of the interest of the party that governed, the other party would rise up and seek to assume power from them. And the other result was likely tyranny, that when one side would win, it would tyrannize over the other side. So here's an ancient philosopher, and this is a theme that's repeated over and over again in the history of political thought, saying that every political order is essentially destined, it would seem, to two outcomes: civil war or tyranny. And if you read the papers today, you read the op-eds, you read the columns, these are two words we see a lot these days. America is in the midst of a new cold civil war, or we are being governed in a tyrannical fashion. These very ancient words have made their way back into our vocabulary. Now, Aristotle wasn't pessimistic about this, in fact. He thought there might be a way to address or redress this basic problem of politics.
He's talking about Aristotle's book, The Politics. Now, Aristotle lived quite a long time ago, a couple hundred years before Jesus, as a matter of fact, so he predates Christianity. And Deneen is recounting the part of the book in which Aristotle talks specifically about two forms of organizing a political society, one having to do with the rule by a small elite of the most wealthy and privileged members of the population, which would be an oligarchy, ruled by the few. That's actual literal translation of the Greek. And then the rule by the many other people who do not have as much privilege or property, the many, which is a democracy. And Aristotle thought that both of these were flawed forms of political organization. Of course, by democracy, doesn't mean exactly what we mean today. Today's democracy has beyond the idea of people getting a vote, ordinary people having a vote. It has a lot of constitutional restraints and individual freedoms built into the First Amendment and things like that, which were not things that Aristotle knew anything about. So he's giving the idea that if there is a way to prevent these things deteriorating into either a civil war or tyranny or both, it would be, and here is where we left off. So he's leading towards the idea of what Aristotle regards as a better form of government, which is neither an oligarchy or a democracy. Let's turn towards the clip in which Deneen talks about that.
The proposal of someone like Aristotle or Polybius or of a whole series of thinkers was to take the elements of these two groups that are found in nearly every political order and to mix them in the hopes and with the intention that the virtues of each side would counteract and cancel out the vices of each side, and that this would actually have the result of creating a good political order. That this would actually, because of the respective virtues of each, they would in some ways contain the vices of each. This wasn't merely checks and balances. This was actually a kind of aspiration to a certain kind of virtue, and a virtue that achieves a kind of moderation, a moderation now of a mixing of extremes, to use the Aristotelian language. Now, one of the hallmarks of this tradition was a stress that to create such a constitution was difficult, such a regime was difficult. But once it was realized, or to the extent it was realized, it required order and stability, and literally a kind of balance. What it actually would be a source of danger to such achievement of such a regime would be instability, rapid change, imbalance, and transformation. For as long as possible, then, Aristotle writes, if one has such a regime, one should seek to continue it forward into time by retaining the balance. In the same way that if you ever walk with like a plank on your head or something, you don't run, you walk with a certain amount of care, trying to keep it balanced as you're moving forward.
So Deneen is describing Aristotle's discussion of mixing elements of oligarchy and democracy to create a more stable regime which has the common good more in its sight, because neither faction of the many or the few can control all the levers of power. And the mixed regime is the term that Deneen uses, in a more clear term than Aristotle uses, which is polity, a word that nobody much uses anymore. And he says the important thing about a mixed regime is to have stability and balance. All right, he's going to talk about this quite a bit, Deneen, and but he doesn't mention one part of Aristotle that I want to give you some ideas. I want to give you some parts of the text. This is from Book 4 of Aristotle's Politics, what he has to say about the importance of a class in between both the rich and the poor. This is Aristotle. In all states, therefore, there exist three divisions of the state: the very rich, the very poor, and thirdly, those who are between the two. It is manifest that the middle amount of all good things of fortune is the best amount to possess. And he believes that people who do not have a high degree of property and wealth, but a modest amount, would be the kind of people that would be most reasonable and would be less likely to have the arrogance and temptation to abuse power than the oligarchic few, and more protective of property rights and stability than the many, who would probably resent the few and try to gain their property and take it away from them and cause chaos and more division within the society, civil war, and then look for a single leader to advance their interests, a demagogue. The idea here is that the people in the middle, he doesn't mean by his cultural middle class that we would know in America, but people who literally are not real rich, but also not especially poor. And then he goes on, this is the second passage I'm going to have, the second and last. Say the political community administered by the middle class is best, and that it is possible for those states to be well governed that are of the kind in which the middle class is numerous and preferably stronger than both the other two classes. So people in the middle of the income spectrum, or the wealth spectrum more properly, would be the folks that would be the best to be numerous. He wants to have a lot of people who are in this position in the middle so they can dominate the political system, or at least hold the balance of power between the other two. And he goes on to say, tyranny springs from both democracy and oligarchy of the most unbridled kind, but much less often from the middle forms of constitution and those near to them. It alone is free from faction, since where the middle class is numerous, factions and party divisions among the citizens are least likely to occur. This idea did influence some of the early Americans, the founders, the people who helped write the Declaration and the Constitution, in particular Thomas Jefferson, who was the third president of the United States. He very much believed that this should be a nation of small property owners, that is, people who own their own farms and were in that middle position where they neither coveted other people's property, nor were they so wealthy that they wanted to dominate and control all the rest of society. That's what he wanted, but it didn't turn out that way, not through his trying. There were also the next couple of presidents who followed him who had a similar vision, but they discovered that the American economy was going in a different direction entirely. Those other two presidents would be James Madison and James Monroe, followers of Jeffersonian thought in this regard. So there was an idea in early America, but it didn't last very long. And I'm going to play now a clip going back to Deneen, who is talking about our modern age and why he thinks things change from the early American. He doesn't mention Jefferson and all that because he doesn't mention at all Aristotle's idea about the people in the middle. Rather, he talks about stability not being founded on a numerous class in the middle of the wealth spectrum. He talks about something entirely different. All right, so here is Deneen once again.
Now, in the book, I make the following argument and claim, and I've been thinking a lot about this, this tradition as it relates to our contemporary politics. And it seems to me that there's a way in which the modern world, modern age, I'm not so sure I'm as fond of it as Russell Kirk seemed to have been. I don't think Russell Kirk really was either. That part of what constitutes modernity, and we could describe it in many ways, is to reject this ancient ideal of what might be the resolution of the divide between the many and the few, and to replace it with what we might describe as a politics of progress, a politics of change, often rapid change, transformation. That rather than seeking order and stability and constancy and continuation, the modern solution to this problem of the divide between the many and the few was to promote a society that would engage in constant and even maybe constantly increasing change and transformation. The liberal tradition itself, beginning with the liberal tradition, overturns this ideal of classical mixed regime, mixed constitution, in favor of a modern philosophy that argues in favor of those who will bear the responsibility of generating a society of rapid and even increasingly rapid change. And the earliest of the liberal thinkers who proposed this was especially those who argued for this, the presence of this kind of change, especially in the economic realm. And that the elites of such a society, especially now the oligarchs of such a society, to use the Aristotelian language, needed in some ways to be protected or buffered from the threats that were posed by the many who in particular would feel a threat of the change and transformation of the economic realm, as well as a certain amount of resentment toward the inequality. Thus, classical liberalism naturally finds its opponent in Marx and Marxism, right, who wants to promote the revolution of the many from below, but it also becomes suspect also of populism more broadly. Populism becomes something suspect in the view, in the eyes of the classical liberal tradition. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised in the contemporary world and in our contemporary politics, those who we might classify as classical liberals have become sort of never-Trumpers or anti-populists. Jonah Goldberg is a really good case in point, a classical liberal who would call himself a conservative, but who especially hates the way in which the promotion of the views of the many poses a threat to a theory of dynamic, constantly transforming economic progress.
He says that the problem happened with a change from a philosophy of stability, which he associates with Aristotle, to a philosophy of change and progress. So the distinction he's making is one that wants to have things move stable and slowly and remain balanced, and one that's kind of continual disruption and change, hopefully for the better. And he's going to single out both an economic change seen as good, progress, continual advancement of the economy, and also cultural changes, changing the ways we think about things, the way we act, the way we behave. In the segment you just saw, he's focusing particularly on economics, but he is giving a causation that is purely based on philosophy. And another word that he never used is capitalism. And the development of capitalism, I would say, preceded the idea that preceded the adoption of these ideas by political elites. Classical liberalism, that's a word he often uses. This designates the modern age. It is a philosophy coming out of Enlightenment times, and the revolutionary Americans were very much steeped in this tradition. Actually, they're steeped in both traditions. The Republican tradition, so-called, had more of Aristotle's mixed regime idea in it, and the classical liberal idealism had more to do with freedom from arbitrary authorities like the divine right of kings, and came out of an entrepreneurial class that was the early capitalists who wanted to use their wealth to invest in new forms of production, and they saw the potential for greater productivity and amassing greater wealth. So the development of capitalism is driving this whole change, and elites are looking around for a way to justify it. So they pick up some of these old ideas that we should have an economy that's not constrained, not by the many. That wasn't their initial concern, but not by a king or an aristocracy, a landed aristocracy, which would be opposed to a new elite developing from this entrepreneurial class, the capitalist class, and challenging their privileges based on simply land ownership and their claims to be a better educated and more civic-minded group, which was not in evidence during the times, especially in places like France or in the Americans' eyes in places like England. He doesn't talk about capitalism so much, but he talks about this change in philosophy and classical liberalism. He designates that as the enemy coming up. But of course, classical liberalism went back a couple hundred years before the change that was happening in early America. And this is what happened to the Jeffersonian vision, is that when the Constitution was written, which is protection for private property, people started to, especially people, his rival Alexander Hamilton had the idea that the government could start advancing capitalism by, creating a national bank and bringing markets to some degree, having a common market within the United States rather than each state controlling its trade. So the idea of the Constitution was really to promote this idea that there could be more of an economy free from the constraints of an elite in the government, not so much against the few. When it became against the few was during the late 19th century with the rise of corporate capitalism and the impoverished condition of most workers who were driven off the land and had to work in factories and such in very miserable conditions and slums and all that, and a lot of organizing, agitating to use the right to vote and to have unions and all that. So that was trying to push back against economic elites at the time who were the capitalists. Had less to do with the philosophy of the time and more to do with how the economy was changing. Almost inevitable with the advance of technology and new forms of production. All right. He also, Deneen is complaining about cultural change, so let's look at a little clip about that as well to get more of the picture of what he's talking about.
But this is no less true in what we would today, of course, describe as the progressive liberal tradition, which is also born out of an antipathy toward the many. Indeed, more than perhaps just a suspicion, an outright denigration and a distinct kind of condescension toward the many. And this is because, to use the language of John Stuart Mill, this is because of their instinctive conservatism, their tendency to be governed by what he calls the despotism of custom. And that if society is going to become a more progressive society, a society of constant transformation and change, and upending of traditional ways of doing things, one needed especially to liberate the distinctive individuals in one's society. Those he praises for their individuality, in order to release what he regards as the human orientation to being creatures who are progressive beings in their essential form. In order to achieve this, he makes the famous argument in On Liberty of liberating these individuals from the constraints of custom and tradition, and in particular, liberating them from the constraints of the demos. The threat of the demos and democracy as acting as a kind of restraint upon the progress of society. One of the ways in which Mill argued that this could be achieved was by plural voting, giving those who were more educated more votes, thereby ensuring that progress would be ensured by those who were more educated being in control of the political process. But as we know today, you don't necessarily need more votes. You just need the institutions, the cultural institutions that can, in some ways, serve as essentially the functional equivalent of plural voting.
An educated elite who believes in progress and not the cultural conservatism, or what's the term he uses, the clinging to custom of the many, are the villains in this story that Deneen is telling. He quotes particularly from Jonathan Stuart Mill over in England at the time in the, I think, late 19th century, seeing the masses as being an obstacle to progress. And I have to clarify, though, that when Deneen is using the term progressives, the word progressive did not mean in the early 20th century what it means now. In fact, it's pretty distinct, even though there are those who would claim the term progressive. Other progressives don't recognize them as progressives. Let me clarify that here. He would call someone like Bill Clinton a progressive, but Bernie Sanders would not regard Bill Clinton as a progressive. What progressive means in the modern parlance of those who use the word most frequently are those who want to go back to something like the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, where the many were actually able to institute a lot of reforms on capitalism, which had driven the country into a depression. And a quarter of the population was out of work, and there was very hard times. So the desire to rein in capitalism is what is now known as progressivism among those who mostly use the label. In an economic sense, wider idea that this is about a cultural change located in elite educational institutions is somewhat connected, but not entirely. So we want to make sure that we're distinguishing economic progressivism, which sounds more like what Deneen would actually like to see, restraints on capitalism from the on behalf of the many, although he never again uses the word capitalism, and not so much about the cultural side. Now, you should also notice here that he has a very big bias against elite educational institutions. Now, he's a professor at the University of Notre Dame, so he's in a fairly elite school, but it's not in the top tier like Harvard or Yale or Princeton. But he is that kind of intellectual elite, but he sees himself as maybe, an outlier of some sort. So he's not including himself. He's saying the elite now controls culture institutions, and in that way they're able to push through these kind of changes in our culture that the many resist and do not like. So education, in his mind, is a bad thing unless it's the right kind of education. The kind of education he would like to give has to do with studying the classics and presumably also rooting people more deeply in the Christian tradition as part of the American tradition, although he does not get to that explicitly either, at least not in this talk. All right, this next part is a little bit longer. It's going to be the final clip I use, and he becomes a lot more passionate about what he has to say about the modern world and what he doesn't like about him. But I would say, starting off, that I think his analysis of what's going on politically in the current situation is way off. It has some resonance with what I see as the real picture, but in other ways he goes way off track, and I will explain that after you have a chance to listen to him in his own words. So let us get back to wherever he is here on my list.
In the 20th century, and in significant part because of what Louise began by saying, because of particular circumstances arising from the Cold War, conservatism, against Russell Kirk's desires, was transformed in a liberal direction. What was called liberalism, especially in the economic sphere, became redescribed as a kind of conservatism. And we actually, it resulted in a kind of uniparty, a party that was consistently liberal, even though it fought against each other in its economic guise, in its economic dimension, what came to be known as conservative, and in its social dimension, what came to be known as progressive. And this divide then became for us the political divide that represented the genuine and only political choice that we as Americans had every year. And if you're like me, you're like me, a Catholic, Doubtless you have had that experience in your life of saying, I don't know who to vote for because they're all problematic. And the fundamental reason that they were all problematic is because they really, at the deepest level, were representing a liberal philosophy, a philosophy of disorder, a philosophy of instability and imbalance. In spite of the constant oscillation between these two liberal parties, one claiming to be economically conservative, i.e. liberal, and one claiming to be socially liberal, it was in fact the case that it was a single project that unfolded consistently over time, constantly bringing more into being the party of progress as the sole party that governed this nation for at least the last 75 years. The economic side of this divide, we called conservatism, but now I think increasingly called neoliberalism. My friend Sohrab Ahmari shamelessly calls them neoliberals. This was originally the project of the right liberals, but of course became adopted and embraced over time by so-called progressives or left liberals, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. This was the project of seeking to dismantle those conservative or stabilizing constraints upon the disorder that an unbridled economy can produce. The disordering that especially impacts those of the lower classes and the working classes. A world-straddling market that was increasingly freed of any kind of limitations and obstacles. And so, at the risk of being condemned in the way that Kevin Roberts was condemned for a recent speech, this resulted in globalization, the globalization of the economy, the outsourcing of our industry, something, again, that Senator Vance knows all too well about, the financialization of our economy, the delinking of basic things like having a mortgage, which is all about having a home, delinking that from places and turning it into a financial product that just left one's community. And of course, the opening, or let's just say the elimination of borders in any very real sense, both in terms of products as well as, of course, labor. And here again, with the aim of producing especially a cheap labor as well as cheap products. And at the same time, this project resulted in an ongoing form of cultural and social revolution, the ongoing liberalization of the social domain, the dismantling, again, of those stabilizing and conservative aspects over the realm of our social lives, the lives that we live responsibly in and through our communities, the decline of what used to be known as decency laws and norms and customs, obscenity. I mean, I grew up in a world in which F-bombs were very rare. And when someone said it, you knew they were angry or it meant something. And now it's just like a verbal tick. It doesn't even mean anything. Indecency, pornography, nakedness, public displays, not just of affection, of basically pornography, blasphemy, sexual mores, divorce, cohabitation, illegitimacy, all of these, the obstacles or the limits, dismantled. Reproduction, the delinking of reproduction of sexuality from reproduction, birth control and abortion, the disassociation of our sexuality from bringing new life into the world, and now abortion being praised as a positive good, something one should celebrate. Of course, marriage, an issue over which we have struggled as a culture, but in fact one which is actually, in spite of the apparent importance of marriage in our national debates, is actually ceasing to exist as a reality. At the very time we were having debates about what is marriage, people were ceasing to get married. And so we have all kinds of relationships. I just saw the New York Times article yesterday advising the best cities to live in if you want to have a polyamorous relationship. And now we don't even increasingly don't want to draw lines on what it is to be a man or a woman, and we have surgical procedures to make sure that line can be erased. This party of progress, then, simultaneously in the economic realm and in the social realm, has dismantled any remnant of what was a kind of residual mixed constitution that existed in the American tradition. And we should note and we should celebrate that this was our Constitution, not necessarily our written Constitution, though I don't think our written Constitution contradicted this, but it was our practice. It is part of the American tradition. And this tradition that prized order and stability and balance was replaced over time by revolutionary disorder, one that prizes liberty as a kind of abstract ideal of simply free choice, disruption, and the language of progress.
He complains that both of our major political parties, the Republicans and Democrats, have been parties of liberalism, disorder, and disbalance, and he dates this change from the old mixed regime idea of early America to roughly the beginning of the Cold War, which would be in the late 1940s or early 1950s. I don't understand it all, giving that as a starting point for this. He has his argument is that both parties essentially have both economic and cultural elites who want this kind of liberal idea of freedom from any control by the masses, and will use it to the disadvantage of the masses and against the resistance of it. And he wants a new elite to come into power to rectify things and bring things back to stability, order. Order is a big word in his vocabulary here at the end, and stability. All right, so order and balance, not stability. I repeated that twice. Progress here. Okay. Economic. Let's talk about the economic side of it first. He says it started around the time of the Cold War, but was adopted by the Democratic Party. It went first for the Republican Party and then was adopted by the Democrats like Clinton here, and then a comparable change in England with Tony Blair, the prime minister at the time. So that would have been the early 90s. Well, I don't know why the Cold War is the time given for this, because actually the Republican Party had adopted forms of economic liberalism at least as late as the early 20th century, when they wanted to do away with any power of the ordinary voter to put restrictions on property rights of major corporations and wealthy people, and vigorously resisted that in any way they could until the Great Depression turns things around. So why the Cold War? I don't know. Republicans had adopted this kind of economic liberalism, free market idea without any kind of regulation or constraint by the government much earlier. And as for the Democratic Party's turn towards neoliberalism, new form of liberalism, economic liberalism, this is just new since the time of the New Deal of Franklin and Roosevelt. That's why it's neoliberalism. It's returning to the liberalism before the New Deal because of the economic problems of the 1970s, causing a lot of ordinary people to feel like, okay, we need to turn in a different direction. So this happened in the 90s, early 90s. So the beginning of the Cold War was the 50s. So this is about 40 years later. That's why I don't think the Cold War makes any sense. I think the Republicans changed at least by the early 20th century, and the Democrats not until the 1990s. So that doesn't make any sense to me. And again, he never mentions any of this stuff about capitalism and the development of capitalism and the crisis of the 1930s and the New Deal, and then the economic problems in the 1970s, which led to the election of Reagan, saying that the Democrats didn't know how to manage the economy. And it was Reagan actually who adopted the evangelical Christians and had that whole part, the part of the coalition devoted to the ideas that he seems to favor in his cultural many idea, that they favor all these things that he complains about having to do with, well, you heard the litany. I'll not repeat all of it, but this same kind of thing you would have heard in my commentary on an interview that Nicole Shanahan with Stephen Wolfe, who regards himself as a Christian nationalist, that I put on my YouTube channel a couple of weeks ago, put on all my channels actually a couple of weeks ago. So you know what those are all about. So, okay, so the economic issues, he doesn't really, to me, talk much about how the changes in the economy under capitalism and then the attempts to rein in capitalism a little bit for the advantage of the many seemed to fail in the 1970s. None of that. To him, it's all philosophy, all change in ideas, which, of course, anyone located in academia, I think, overestimates the importance of ideas in contradistinction to how economics can change things and culture can change without their influence. All right, so the cultural side of it, I think the Republican Party in the 1980s started to adopt some of these positions that he favors, and the Democrats have stuck with them for the most part, even though the Democrats are divided now between the neoliberalism, sometimes called the centrist or moderate Democrats, and those who are rejecting that and want to return to the New Deal, who would be more the progressives, at least in the economic sense. So the big complaints he has now, I want to ask you, is this really something that's restricted to the elites, or is it something that the majority of the population has actually come around to as well? Things like the use of obscene language, the F bomb, as he calls it, isn't that something that the masses have accepted? And not only that, the mega crowd seems to revel in the use of it. Pornography, I don't know if people would say they're in favor of it, but an awful lot of people access it online. Gay marriage is something that the public has come around to favoring by a majority. Abortion, especially women, are very much in favor of less restrictions on abortion, not the kind of thing that presumably Deneen would like to see. Birth control, even Catholics think birth control is a good thing. Here he thinks it's somehow something that's eroding the culture and against the many in the favor of an elite. And then divorce as well. Pretty widespread, and people accept it as something normal, whereas he seems to think that all these things are just being pushed by some kind of educational elite. Not the case. I think education has been widespread, which means people have been more exposed to different thoughts and different ways of thinking about him. One of the things I've been talking about is biblical studies and how the general public has become more aware of discrepancies in the Bible and thus more conflicted about how much they believe. But also earlier than that, this actually did happen around the 1950s and 60s, is that we had more Catholics entering the public realm. Whereas before, Protestant versions of the Christian religion in America were widespread and dominant, the reason it became more diverse was largely because Catholics started to organize and achieve elite positions and challenge the dominance of purely Protestant forms of pushing Christianity, like in the schools and places like that. And then you had, of course, Jewish people having more sway in the mid 20th century than they had early in the 20th century. And in the 1960s, you had more open immigration, not just for these kinds of the poor and huddled masses that Trump seems to disdain, but for people who were more educated from different parts of the world. And so we had more diversity happening in the 1950s and 60s, and that's why there was a change. More people entering higher education, being exposed to scientific thought, challenges like the theory of evolution, Copernican theory, challenging the idea that the Earth was created in 8 days or whatever it was, 7 days that God created the world. Yeah, it sounds like I don't know my Bible very well. I guess I'm thinking of the Beatles, 8 days a week. Anyway, so very triggered by these cultural issues, which to me sound like the province of an intellectual few, that is these Christian or Catholic intellectuals who are very much against the very widespread public adoptions of attitudes that challenge their own beliefs. Now, this means that the mega coalition does not represent the many in the sense that he would like it to. It is, they didn't even get a majority in the popular election of Trump, the popular vote for Trump in 2024, even though he barely won a majority of the electoral votes by getting just slightly more votes in each of the so-called swing states. So not a majority coalition by any means, and the part of it represented by these Christian conservatives and Christian nationalists and post-liberal Catholics is a small part of that coalition that other parts of the coalition have no use for. There are the techno elites and the old conservatives who are not interested in those issues, are more interested in deregulation of the economy. And there's a big fight going in that. So in no way is that the representative views of the majority, at least in my mind. He does regard these parties of progress, both of them, as forms of tyranny, yet he is calling for a new elite to impose its vision of a stable and culturally conservative philosophy on the country to gain control of our educational institutions and to push their own version. He does not seem to be calling for empowering ordinary people with the right to vote or the right to organize or to free up third parties from the dominance of the two major parties, or even to advance, economic progressives within the Democratic Party, but rather to have a new elite with the insight of classical tradition and Christian philosophy that can set things straight for the rest of us. That's my concern. This is just a new elite who is trying to dominate with their vision. They're very uncomfortable with the modern world, particularly challenges to religious views having to do with anything sexual in nature. I just don't think his story is a very convincing one. All right, tell me what you think. I like to hear from you in my comments. Please do find something to say. My comments seem to be trickling off as well as my viewers. It's up and down, actually. So I do like to hear from you. And if you like this, subscribe, share, all the rest of that. I could use a little boost at this time because it seems like gradually my viewership is, waning as people get tired of politics, maybe. All right, that's it for now. And I will have more for you sometime fairly soon. Bye.